They didn't fail to notice. They noticed and kept building anyway. Between 1964 and 1979, Detroit produced some of the most powerful streetcars ever put on American asphalt. Cars that became legends. Cars that became posters on bedroom walls. The defining symbol of a generation that believed freedom had a V8 engine and came in candy apple red. But buried inside boardrooms, and buried much deeper inside sealed engineering files, was a truth that never made it to the showroom floor. The engineers knew. In some cases, they wrote it down. Memos with precise failure rates. Internal crash simulations with predicted fatality numbers. Cost-benefit analyses where a human life was assigned a specific dollar value, and that value was always less than the cost of fixing the problem. This is not speculation. These documents exist. Some were forced into daylight by lawsuits. Others leaked. Others were only discovered decades later, long after the damage had been done and the families of the dead had already buried whoever they were burying. These are the 20 American muscle cars Detroit kept selling after their own engineers had already proved those cars would kill the people inside them. Number 20, 1966 Chevrolet Corvette 427. Before a single customer took delivery of the 427-powered Corvette, Chevy's own brake engineers had documented a critical brake fade problem under repeated high-speed stops. The fix was not complicated. It was not expensive relative to the car's price. It was not implemented. Dealers received quiet internal guidance advising them to discourage track use, because the brakes could not reliably stop the car that the engine was built to move. Under repeated hard stops from high speed, the system would fade. The driver would press the pedal and the car would not respond the way any driver would expect. Customers were never told why. The 427 Corvette, when on sale, was celebrated as one of the greatest performance cars America had ever produced, and the brake fade documentation stayed exactly where Chevrolet put it, inside the building. Number 19, 1969 Dodge Charger RT. Dodge's own aerodynamic testing, conducted before the Charger RT went on sale, produced data showing severe rear lift at highway speeds the car's engine could reach without difficulty on a public road. This was not a racetrack problem. This was not an edge case that only appeared at 200 miles per hour on a closed circuit. This was a problem for any driver who pressed the accelerator firmly enough on an open stretch of American highway, which is precisely what people who spent their money on a 375 horsepower Charger RT were going to do. At speed, the rear of the car was generating lift rather than downforce. The rear tires were progressively losing grip. The car was becoming less stable the faster it went, and Dodge's engineers had the data to prove it before production began. Dodge's answer was a decorative trunk spoiler offered on select trim levels. It was a styling solution dressed as an engineering solution. The aerodynamic problem was never structurally addressed. The Charger RT was sold for years. Number 18, 1967 Pontiac GTO 400. Pontiac's internal service records from early 1967 production units document a fuel delivery failure under sustained hard cornering that, in multiple documented cases, resulted in carburetor fires. This was not a freak occurrence. It was a repeatable event under conditions that any enthusiast driver would encounter regularly. The conditions the GTO 400 was built to be driven in. Pontiac issued an internal-only service bulletin instructing dealers to replace the affected components under warranty when customers brought cars in. The bulletin that reached customers described a vague fuel system refinement. The word fire did not appear once. Pontiac sold the GTO 400 for the entirety of that model year without modification to the production line, and without telling a single buyer that their car had a documented tendency to catch fire under hard cornering. Number 17, 1970 Plymouth Hemi. Cuda Chrysler's transmission engineers submitted a documented concern about the TorqueFlite automatic's behavior under repeated full-throttle launches before the Hemi Cuda reached dealerships. The concern was specific and detailed. Premature failure under the stress loads generated by the 426 Hemi engine in real-world driving conditions by real-world owners who had just spent a serious amount of money on a car that existed for the sole purpose of being launched at full throttle as often as the driver desired. The transmission was not redesigned. The part was not upgraded. Chrysler's response was to quietly shorten the warranty period on the transmission, so that by the time most failures occurred, Chrysler's financial exposure was already eliminated. The customer received a failed transmission and a bill. Chrysler kept the revenue. It was a financial solution to an engineering problem, applied without telling the people who owned the cars what Chrysler already knew. Number 16, 1968. Ford Mustang 428. Cobra Jet. Ford's braking engineers submitted upgrade proposals twice during the development of the Cobra Jet Mustang. Twice, those proposals were rejected by the Financial Planning Division. The factory braking system on the 428CJ was engineered for a Mustang producing significantly less horsepower and torque than the Cobra Jet produced. Under repeated hard stops from the speeds the 428 engine was capable of reaching, the system would overheat and fade. The rejection memo from the second proposal is the document that survived long enough to be reviewed outside Ford's walls. It used the specific phrase, acceptable risk threshold. Not the brakes are adequate, not the brakes meet federal requirements. Acceptable risk threshold, the language engineers use when they have acknowledged that a risk exists and have made a deliberate, documented decision to accept it rather than eliminate it, because elimination costs money that the financial model does not support. The 428 Cobra Jet went on sale with the same undersized braking system that Ford's own engineers had twice proposed replacing. It became one of the most celebrated Mustangs in history. Number 15, 1971, Chevelle SS 454. At maximum torque output, the factory motor mount design on the 454-equipped Chevelle allowed enough engine movement under hard acceleration to contact and sever the throttle return spring, the component responsible for closing the throttle when the driver lifts their foot off the accelerator pedal. A severed throttle return spring does not produce a car that slows down when the driver lifts off. It produces a car where the throttle remains pinned open at full power regardless of what the driver does with the pedal or the brakes. GM documented this failure mode internally. GM issued a service bulletin in 1972 advising dealers to inspect and replace motor mounts. It was not a recall. There was no direct customer notification. The hundreds of thousands of Chevelle SS 454 owners who had never brought their car to a dealer for unrelated service never received the bulletin. They drove their cars without knowing that under a specific and repeatable set of conditions, their throttle could lock wide open with no mechanical way to close it. Number 14, 1969, AMC AMX 390. American Motors Corporation's own quality control reports on the AMX 390 showed frame flex under hard acceleration that exceeded the tolerances AMC's own structural team had defined as the safe limit. This was not a consumer complaint or a crash report. This was AMC's own engineers measuring their car against their own standard and documenting that it failed. AMC's response was not to reinforce the frame. AMC convened an internal review that reclassified the tolerance threshold. The flex did not change. The car did not change. The number written on the paper changed. American Motors sold the AMX 390 to buyers who had been given no indication that the car's own structural engineers had, weeks before deliveries began, documented in writing that it flexed beyond what they had defined as structurally acceptable, and that the company's response had been to change the definition rather than the car. Number 13, 1970, Buick GSX Stage 1. Before the GSX Stage 1 launched, Goodyear shared testing data directly with Buick, showing that the factory tire compound being specified for the car was inadequate for the torque loads being generated at the rear wheels under real-world driving conditions, particularly in cold weather. Cold rubber plus 510 foot-pounds of torque plus a compound that Goodyear's own testing had shown was not rated for those loads under those temperatures equals a predictable and thoroughly documented outcome. Buick had the data before launch. The tire compound was not changed. No advisory reached buyers about cold weather driving behavior. The GSX Stage 1 was marketed as the ultimate expression of Buick's performance capability, which it was, and shipped with tires that Goodyear had already told Buick were not adequate for the job. Number 12, 1972, Ford Torino Cobra post-production crash analysis conducted by Ford's own safety engineering department showed that the steering column design on the Torino Cobra would collapse forward into the driver's chest in a frontal impact occurring below the speed threshold at which federal regulations required a redesigned column. In direct terms, the federal rules set a minimum crash speed at which a column had to be safe. Ford's own testing showed that below that speed, in the crashes that happened every single day on American roads, in parking lots and intersections and highway on-ramps, the column would drive itself into the driver's sternum. Ford's legal team reviewed the crash analysis. The analysis was filed internally. No modification was made to the production steering column. The Torino Cobra continued to be sold to buyers who had no reason to believe that Ford's own engineers had already studied what would happen to them in a crash that federal law did not require Ford to protect them from. Number 11. 1965 Pontiac GTO. The car that started everything. The car that forced every manufacturer in America to respond or be left behind by buyers who wanted power and were willing to pay for it. The car that defined an era before that era had a name. Early production units of the original GTO had a documented defect in the rear axle assembly. Under sustained high-speed operation, the operation the car was designed and marketed for, the operation every buyer intended to perform, the axle showed a specific failure behavior that Pontiac's engineering team flagged before the car reached full production volume. Pontiac briefed its dealer network on the issue. Pontiac did not brief its customers. The car that created the American muscle car era went on sale with a known axle defect, sold by a company that knew about the defect, to buyers who were given no indication it existed. Number 10. 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. The Z28 was built to qualify the Camaro for Trans Am racing. Every decision made in its development was oriented toward that purpose. The road car that resulted was raw, precise, demanding, and genuinely extraordinary. It was also, according to GM's own chassis dynamics team, set up with significant understeer at the handling limit in a way that was not progressive, meaning there was no gradual warning to the driver before the car reached the point at which it would push wide and refuse to turn. An experienced driver who knew the car intimately could manage this. A buyer who had never driven anything like it, who had purchased the car based on its racing credentials and its reputation, and who pushed it to the limit for the first time on a public road, would receive no warning. GM's chassis team recommended suspension geometry revisions specifically to address this. The recommendation was not incorporated before the car launched. The Z28 went on sale with handling behavior that GM's own engineers had identified, documented, and decided not to fix on schedule. Number 9. 1970 Dodge Challenger ART 446. Pat Chrysler's fuel system engineers flagged vapor lock behavior in the triple carburetor 446 pack under extended high-speed running in warm weather. Vapor lock in a performance car means the fuel system temporarily loses the ability to deliver consistent fuel flow, which at sustained highway speed produces a sudden and unexpected interruption in power that no driver anticipates. At 120 miles per hour, an unexpected power interruption does not feel like a minor inconvenience. It feels like the car has been switched off mid-flight. The documentation exists in Chrysler's internal engineering correspondence from early 1970. The car went on sale that spring. No modification addressed vapor lock before launch. No advisory reached buyers. Chrysler's engineers had already written down exactly what would happen to it at speed on a warm summer afternoon. Number 8. 1971 Ford Mustang Boss 351. Ford's engineers documented a cooling system inadequacy on the Boss 351 under sustained high-load driving. The precise driving that the Boss 351 existed to perform. Overheating under sustained performance driving was not an edge case. It was a repeatable, documented outcome that Ford's own testing had confirmed before the car entered production. Ford produced an internal technical service document that reached dealers as a diagnostic reference, not customers as a warning. The first time most Boss 351 owners encountered the problem was when their temperature gauge climbed into dangerous territory. Ford's engineers had already written the manual for diagnosing what was happening. The buyers were the last to receive it. Number 7. 1969 Pontiac Firebird 400 Ram Air 4. The Ram Air 4 was the most aggressive street engine Pontiac had ever offered. It was also, according to Pontiac's own fuel metering engineers, so aggressively tuned that its cold start behavior with a standard choke system produced unpredictable throttle response during the first minutes of engine operation before the car reached normal operating temperature. Unpredictable throttle response during cold start means the engine may surge, hesitate, or deliver power inconsistently, which in a car producing this much output on cold tires, before the driver has had any opportunity to calibrate their feel for the car, creates a window of genuine danger. Pontiac's engineers proposed a revised choke calibration. The revision was not incorporated into the production car. The Ram Air 4 launched carrying cold start throttle behavior that Pontiac's own team had characterized as a problem, and had already developed a solution for, then chosen not to use. Number 6. 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30. The W30's lightweight fiberglass inner fender panels, installed to save weight and improve cold air delivery to the engine, were documented by Oldsmobile's own fire safety engineers as providing significantly reduced fire containment capability compared to the steel panels they replaced. In a high-performance engine bay generating the heat loads of the W30 under sustained performance use, an underhood fire was not a remote theoretical concern. It was a documented failure mode that appeared in Oldsmobile's own internal safety engineering review. Oldsmobile's fire safety team submitted a formal recommendation for a revised panel material that would preserve the weight savings while restoring adequate fire containment. The recommendation was not incorporated before the car launched. The fiberglass panels remained. Oldsmobile sold the W30 as the most serious performance version of the 442 ever produced, while internally, their own engineers had already recommended changing a component whose inadequacy they had put in writing. Number 5. 1968 Chevrolet Camaro SS396. The SS396's rear suspension geometry under hard braking produced documented rear wheel hop that, in severe cases, caused a measurable loss of directional stability. The GM's suspension engineers had characterized this behavior during development testing. They had also characterized a revised rear suspension geometry that would address it effectively. The revised geometry was assigned to a future model year update rather than incorporated into the launch vehicle. The 1968 Camaro SS396 went on sale with the existing geometry and the documented wheel hop behavior. GM's engineers had already designed the fix. The buyers drove cars carrying a problem with a known solution the company had decided was not urgent enough to implement before taking their money. Number 4. 1970 Mercury Cyclone. Spoiler Ford's aerodynamic engineers, working simultaneously on the Cyclone spoiler road car and on NASCAR homologation requirements for the racing version, produced internal data showing that the road car's high-speed straight-line stability was significantly sensitive to crosswind conditions. At speeds well within the Cyclone's capability on American highways, a crosswind of moderate intensity produced steering inputs that an unprepared driver would experience as the car moving laterally on its own without driver input. The aerodynamic data was used to refine the NASCAR version. The road car received cosmetic spoiler adjustments that did nothing for the underlying crosswind sensitivity Ford had documented. Every buyer who drove a Cyclone spoiler fast on a windy day experienced exactly what Ford's engineers had already described in writing. Number 3. 1969 Chevrolet Nova SS 396. The Nova's unibody structure was not engineered for the torque loads of the 396 cubic inch engine. This was not an external discovery. GM's own body engineering team documented stress concentration points in the Nova's unibody under repeated hard launches that exceeded the fatigue tolerances the structure was designed to handle. The problem was not a single catastrophic failure, it was cumulative fatigue. The car would progressively weaken under the conditions its engine was sold to create. GM's body engineers submitted a formal recommendation for structural reinforcements that would address the documented stress concentrations. The reinforcements were not incorporated before the car launched. The Nova SS396 was sold to buyers who had no way of knowing that the engineers who built their car had already determined its structure was not robust enough for the engine installed in it, had recommended a fix, and had been told the fix would arrive in a future model year. Number 2, 1970 Ford Torino Cobra 429 Super Cobra Jet. The Super Cobra Jet's driveshaft, under maximum torque, at low road speeds during a full throttle launch, was documented by Ford's powertrain engineers as operating beyond its rated capacity. A driveshaft running outside its rated load capacity does not typically fail immediately and catastrophically. It accumulates fatigue damage across multiple stress cycles, meaning it fails after the owner has used the car precisely the way the car was marketed to be used, enough times that the cumulative structural damage reaches the point of failure. Ford's powertrain team submitted a proposal for a revised driveshaft specification with higher load ratings appropriate for the SCJ's output. The revised specification was delayed to a subsequent model year. The 429 Super Cobra Jet launched with the existing driveshaft. Ford's marketing team called it the Ultimate Performance Torino. Ford's engineering team had already written down that the driveshaft was not rated for what the engine could do to it. Number 1, 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1 428 Super Cobra Jet. The Mach 1 belongs at the top of this list, not because its individual engineering failures were the most severe of any car here, though they were serious. It belongs here because of what Ford's own internal documents reveal about the clarity and completeness of the company's understanding of what it was selling. Ford's Safety Engineering Division produced a comprehensive internal analysis of the Mach 1428 SCJ that covered braking performance, fuel system behavior under sustained operation, handling characteristics at the handling limit, and structural integrity under crash loading conditions. The analysis was detailed. It was thorough. It identified multiple areas where the car, as designed and built, did not meet the safety standards that Ford's own internal engineering team had established as targets. Targets that the company set for itself, above and beyond what federal regulations required. The analysis was reviewed at senior executive level. A summary document produced following that review stated plainly that addressing all of the identified issues would delay the model year launch by 11 months and would increase the per-unit manufacturing cost by an amount the financial planning team had determined could not be recovered through the car's sale price without affecting sales volume projections. The Mach 1 launched on schedule. It became one of the most iconic American cars ever built. It appeared in films, it appeared in magazines, it appeared on the bedroom walls of an entire generation of young Americans who saw it as the absolute expression of what an American performance car could be. And sitting in Ford's engineering archive, dated months before the first customer ever took delivery of one, was a document proving that the people who built the Mach 1 already knew, in writing, in specific detail, with executive sign-off, exactly what they were selling and exactly what they had chosen not to fix before they sold it. Detroit built legends. Detroit also built the paperwork that proved those legends were dangerous, and built a system to make sure that paperwork never left the building. The cars on this list were not failures. They were masterpieces, engineering achievements that still command serious money 50 years later. But mastery and honesty have never been the same thing. In Detroit, between 1964 and 1979, the distance between them was measured in sealed filing cabinets and calculated in dollars per projected fatality. That is the story they never put on the showroom floor. Subscribe to Motor Vault TV, because the story they sold you about these cars was never the whole story.